I'm Willie Sullivan from the Electoral Reform Society. I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves so they can tell you what they want you to know.
Okay. Am I introducing myself and saying something?
No, just introduce yourself.
Just introduce myself. Hello, my name is Frances Crook and I'm co-convener on the Commission on Political Power. My co-convener is Frances de Souza, Baroness de Souza. That's it? That's it.
That's
okay.
it.
Hi, I'm Aoife Clements and I'm the founder of 50/50 NI, and we work to get more women into politics in Northern Ireland. And I'm also a PhD researcher.
Hi, I'm Jess Blair. I'm director of the Electoral Reform Society in Wales. There are two of us on this panel.
Yeah. I feel like Val Doonigan up here. I don't know if anybody remembers Val Doonigan, but probably not. Yeah, I think we're going to talk about democracy in the nations. I'm the only Scot here, so I might make a few comments about Scotland. Just before we go into it, I think when we think about democracy in the nations, we're obviously talking about democracy within the state. And while, I mean, it's been discussed here that we need democracy in a lot more places than just the state, I think it's really important to work out how we make the state act in the interests of society, the wider society, and also how it facilitates or blocks democracy happening in other spaces as well. I think that argument that we're making about more democracy and where it happens, the state's got a crucial role in kind of facilitating that or blocking it, as it often does. I also think there's a kind of an on-running narrative now that state power is in decline. I think that's often the case, that power kind of tries to hide itself a bit, or people want you to think power isn't where it is. I think for me, COVID particularly, and also we had a session yesterday on corruption and transparency and where the lobbying and money goes in relation to the state. I think you just have to follow the money to show that the states are still everywhere the most power, the biggest site of power. So that becomes crucial about then how that power is used. And I think a lot of the problems or distrust that we've seen in democracy at the moment that have been, aired widely here, come about because people no longer believe that the state is acting in their interests. And that's a break in a promise. There's a promise that democracy will ensure that state power is exercised in our interests. I think all states are kind of weirdly unique. The UK probably more than most. We have a second chamber that is unelected, only beaten in size by the People's Republic of China. We have an electoral system that you probably wouldn't use for a reality TV show, let alone Eurovision. And we have a super state of 3.5 nations, which is kind of forced to be together in some ways. It's not a unity of choice. And I think often from the edges, it's from Scotland anyway, it's even more possible, I think, to see how weird the UK is. And we've added to that. I think, from the divine right of kings to our benefits from empire, Scotland's been part of the weirdness of the UK for sure. But I do think that in Scotland, there is an intellectual critique of the British state and the British establishment that is, and in Wales as well, that is really, really helpful for all of us to kind of try and understand what we do about the problems of the British state. Just because it's for obvious reasons, it's sometimes easier to look from the outside. I'm just going to finish on 4 observations from Scotland, just to put them out there. If they come up in further discussion, we can explore them further. But at the moment, I think they stand on their own. First is that nationalism is important. And I think the SNP have shown that you can have a civic inclusive nationalism Tom Nairn, the famous Scottish historian, wrote about this. And there's so many people on the left in Scotland that understand that. And I'm not, the nation's important to people. We can't escape it. And you either ignore it and it becomes, you know, as it predominantly is, used for authoritarianism and exclusive and dividing this, or it might be used for something from different. The second thing is that despite Scotland having an SNP Green government, which probably has some of the most progressive rhetoric on earth, we still have problems like, up to recently, the government was supportive of new drilling in the North Sea. We still have problems with child poverty getting worse. So there's something in that about state capture, and how do the institutions of the state manage to, despite the rhetoric and the best wishes and the plans, still not manage to crack these problems. There's something about the way the institutions operate. And the final point I would make is about leadership. And it seems to me that this old-fashioned type of political leadership, which is about charisma, being good at communication, being felt to be safe, these inevitably seem to end up somewhere bad. And whether that's like Sturgeon or Blair, arguably, or even Johnson to an extent, you know, these sort of characteristics of leadership perhaps are not what we're looking for. And the final point I would make is, like, it's very difficult. This is because this, I guess Corbyn was antithesis to those type of leaderships, and that didn't work either. So what do we do? But considering Corbyn and also considering the Scottish independence referendum, one of the things that I've kind of alighted on recently, it's virtually impossible to make much progress in Britain constitutionally or about, you know, redistribution of power with in a nose to nose with the British establishment. And what does that mean? What if we can't make progress with the British establishment against us? What does that mean for constitutional change? So those are my comments, thoughts. I'm just going to hand over to Frances now to say a few words, and then we'll go along the panel and then have a discussion and open up to questions.
Thank you. I'm going to be very brief. And I'm going to start by just explaining something about the Commission and some of the work we've done on trying to devolve power, or suggesting how power should be devolved. And then I'm going to ask you to help us. So first of all, the Commission itself is a loose collection of people. We're not a charity, we're not an organisation, we're here for a short time. We'll put our views forward, we'll collect your ideas, put them into papers, try and get some change, contribute to the debate, and then we'll all go home and I'll look after my grandchildren. By the way, my grandchildren were born in Wales, so they're Welsh. They've got a Scottish father and an English mother, so I think we're all well represented there. Our next inquiry is going to be, for the Commission, is going to be on local power. I think I'm going to call it Follow the Money, having listened to the debate this morning. And I think because we haven't started that yet, we're going to have the first meeting in a couple of weeks. I want to just set out the principle, which is local. I'm a great fan of local. You have to have some region, and that's fine. And we heard today about how that works quite well in Manchester, but really local is very, very important. I was a local councillor for some years, many, many years ago, but I went canvassing recently for my local political party, and it was really noticeable. Every single door I banged on, and I did a lot in the rain, they knew the names of their local councillors. They said their names to me. I didn't say them to the people on the doorstep. It was extraordinary. And yet they can't name their local MP. Because he's a Tory. Oh, did I say that? Sorry. That's in my head, not out loud. So local is very important. Now, there's a lot wrong, or we've heard a lot of what's wrong with the state. And some of the things that the Commission has come up with is there is enormous executive overreach. The power of the central state, I can't remember who, or somebody said the country's run by 50 people. I think that's right. The power of the central state is enormous, and that's one of the things we have to combat somehow. Some of the things we've come up with is increasing the power of Parliament, particularly committees. I was at a select committee, a standing committee yesterday, one of those, yesterday, and it was really interesting looking at the constitutional issues and the future of the House of Lords. And the debate was absolutely excellent. Yes, we should put the roles of government and members of Parliament clearly set out. Members of Parliament have no job description. So let's put things on a statutory footing, make it very clear. Andy Burnham talked about having a written constitution. I think that may be a step too far. One of the things I've learned over the years, you can't have a revolution in this country. It's just not going to happen. Happened in the 17th century, it hasn't happened since. But what you can have is incremental change. So learning from the 17th century, because I am an historian, is an instrument of government. So have something which sets out the relationship between local and national government. A written constitution would be a huge change, but we can have a simple document which sets out that relationship very clearly in statute, which I think would be a step forward. It's something that Oliver Cromwell did. I know he did a lot of bad things, but he did some good things too, which set out the relationship between the Protectorate and Parliament. And I think we could have an instrument of government which would set out that relationship between local and national government. We've also done some work on the head of state. My commission includes people who are great royalists, and Polly Toynbee, who's not. What we've kind of come down to is that there should be some kind of perhaps ceremonial head of state. This matters because it sucks into it enormous power. Don't think that the king is purely ceremonial. He's not. He wields enormous influence. And quietly, meets the Prime Minister every week, has power over legislation. And if you really want to devolve power to local areas, land reform in Scotland, for example, he interfered like mad in that. We need to take a lot of power away from the head of state. Power needs to go down, not up. One of the other things we've looked at is the reform of the House of Lords. We've said, call it a Senate. And one of our ideas is that, building on what Gordon Brown said about regional representation, is put the metro mayors automatically into a reconfigured Senate and have local council leaders sitting by rotation, much as the bishops do at the moment, get rid of the bishops, into a reformed Senate. So you have current local representation at a national level. That way it goes up and it goes down, and it's current, rather than people in the House of Lords who say, when I was a councillor 40 years ago, which I can say too. So that's a structural change. I think if we can bring in some incremental structural changes which connect better central power and central government with local power and local government, we can hopefully devolve more power locally. But as I say, the important thing, which I have learned very much from Henry today, is follow the money. So what my plea is to hear your ideas. We want to know how local government should be funded, how we could increase local, structurally increase local power, local people, and what it could look like in different stages. So it could be small steps, baby steps, to big steps. We want to hear it all your ideas. Please look at our website, the Commission's website, and do get in touch with us. We're officially going to launch this inquiry in a couple of weeks with a session with Lord Shipley, who's going to introduce, but I will be looking for other people to come and talk to the Commission, experts particularly on ideas on how to finance local government. So thank you very much. I found the whole thing absolutely fascinating today. It's been wonderful. And I'm very grateful to you because I'm learning more from you than you are from me.
Thanks, Frances. Yeah, a topic that you raised has come up quite a lot about incrementalism, that we only can make these kind of changes in an incremental way. And that's, been my experience. but I'm just looking at the growing decline of trust in democracy and the problems that we're not addressing: climate change, growing inequality. How much increment? How big do these increments have to be? So I'm just throwing that out there. If any of the speakers want to address incrementalism and how big the increments are when they talk, that's fine, or the audience does. But yeah, it's a big question, I think. Now over to Aoife.
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm like jealous to hear everyone else speak about like these interesting forms of deliberative democracy and like citizens assembly, but in Northern Ireland we don't have basic democracy. So I would hope that everybody here is aware that the Northern Ireland Assembly has been out for over a year, maybe almost 2 now, for the 5th time, which is very frustrating because it means that a lot of our decisions are being made by Chris Heaton-Harris, who was not elected by anybody in Northern Ireland. Especially in terms of like the budget, which he says is not, but we view as very punitive. The budget distribution to Northern Ireland this term was tiny. The excuse was that we overspent previously, but it means that normally when we have these lapses in democracy, civil society really steps in and does really great work helping people out. But this time they can't because there's no money to step in and do this work, which is really, it's really sad. I guess getting democracy back up and running is something that then, like, if our parties won't do it, I guess we're looking to the UK government to say, can you incentivize them, please? But the opinion of people in Northern Ireland and what we feel is happening is that, you guys are all in election mode now and you just don't care, like, oh, you guys can sort it out. If you don't sort it out, that's fine. We'll come back to it after the election. That's kind of the attitude that we think the UK government has at the minute, which is really disappointing. Yeah, I mean, and I guess there are lots of ways that we can try and incentivize the parties to come back. One of the ways is that they've had their salary cut, and then there is a sort of, the opinion is that it should be cut again. But there are lots of MLAs that are elected and are doing everything that they can in the absence of an assembly. They're doing great work in their community, but they are also being punished because one party won't come back into the assembly or an elected speaker. So what do we do? And then there's also the problem that if they have their salary cut, that's fine, but then we've just seen them all getting second jobs. I mean, I think there's an MLA who recently took up a job as a football coach, and he clearly doesn't have time for his constituency work if he's coaching a Gaelic football team. It's very disappointing to see a lot of people are doing private consulting work and lobbying and things like that. So that's really disappointing. I guess what I'm trying to say is it would be nice for the UK government to put a bit more work in and try and incentivize the parties to come back, rather than these blanket reduce the salary for everyone, or obviously the financial package 3.3 billion. I think that would encourage people to come back. It clearly hasn't. So yeah, that's the state of democracy in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, just on, there's probably going to be an election this year and possibly a change of government. Do you know what Labour's saying about getting institutions back up and working? Or
I actually don't, and I feel like that's a problem. Yeah. I should know what Labour are saying about institutions getting back up.
Yeah. I mean, have you got any hope for a new government?
There was really big hope before Christmas. Everybody thought that they were going to come back. The Northern Ireland office, all the staff were sent to Hillsborough Castle, spent a whole week there, and everyone thought that they would be back. And at the last minute, DUP were like, no, we're not. So it's so delicate, like we get all these new deadlines, everybody gets their hopes up, and then something small will happen, and one party will say, no, actually, I've changed my mind.
And the power's not in Northern Ireland to be able to do this, or the rules of the way the institutions are set up make it up to the parties, right?
Yeah, because we have a mandatory coalition, so like everybody has to agree or it doesn't work.
Yeah. And there's nothing that what can be done at Westminster then? Do you know? Would it be a change in legislation or?
Well, yes, that is when it happened again this time. We thought this is the time. Will there be a legislative change? There's going to be a new rules around getting the party back up and running, and also there's these wider talks about the rise of the middle in Northern Ireland. It's not just green and orange anymore. So maybe we need to restructure the Good Friday Agreement a little bit to sort of reflect that change in society. And there was hopes that when it collapsed this time that maybe that would happen, but it still hasn't happened. I mean, normally I think they just wait until they're willing to come back, but this time, especially in the midst of the cost of living crisis, like it seems a bit more desperate. Like, you know, DUP won't come back to the party, but to me, I mean, when I see them, I'm like, I don't know how you sleep at night. I mean, like there's kids that are in desperate situations because you won't come back for an ideological reason. You think your identity is at risk. Your identity is not at risk. You're still going to be British. It's fine, you know. Yeah. I mean, they have, but they have reduced their salary. But there's lots of MLAs, like I said, that want to come back. I mean, a friend of mine who was an MLA, I quit because she was like, I can't do this. I really want, she had a whole private members bill she wanted to get put through about like expulsion in schools. Like she's really into education, really amazing work. And it got to the point where she was like, I can't do this. I'm wasting my time. So she left. And there are some people, you know, that are kind of in that same mindset. There are some MLAs that have been in the job for a long time. They're amazing. They do as much as they possibly can without the existence of an assembly. So it's unfair, I guess, to cut everyone's pay, but that's the only sort of tool that they have used thus far.
Thanks very much. I mean, it's been a while since the Good Friday Agreement, and I think that kind of tells us that, you know, in a highly charged political and changing environment like Northern Ireland, or anywhere for that matter, really, the rules of the institutions kind of have to keep up, and they fall behind. But I'm going to ask Jess now to talk about where that's a bit different, because the Welsh constitutional arrangements are growing and changing in quite positive ways. So over to you, Jess.
Yeah, I'm hoping to be a little bit more optimistic actually over here. And I'm also hoping to be brief because I really do feel like I'm going to fall off this chair. But I think maybe it'd be useful if I did a bit of a recap into what's been happening in Wales. And then I definitely want to kind of pull out some key, I don't know if they're themes or kind of lessons that we've learned. But the devolution in Wales will be 25 years old this year, a quarter of a century old. And the Senedd, the Welsh Parliament that we have now, is very different from the one we had back in 1999. That was established essentially as a National Assembly for Wales with very limited powers, no lawmaking powers. And that really has grown over the past quarter of a century. We now have a fully fledged Welsh Parliament, the Senedd, which makes laws, which has additional powers devolved to it. And those include powers over elections. So in 2018, we had elections devolved to Wales. And since then, I think the first thing was the extension of the franchise to 16, 17-year-olds and foreign nationals for the 2021 and 2022 elections. And the Council General will be speaking after this session, so I don't kind of want to preempt what he might say, but we do currently have two bills progressing through the Senedd around major democratic reform. The first of those, the Senedd Cymru Members and Elections Bill, it's ingrained in my brain, honestly, these bill titles, will increase the size of the Senedd from a really paltry 60 to 96, bring it much more into line with the Scottish Parliament and Stormont when it sits. It will also change the voting system and change the boundaries that we use in Wales to elect our members. The second of these, the Elections and Elected Bodies Bill, I think really could revitalise elections in Wales and reform institutions. In that bill, there are pilots and trials around automatic voter registration. There's the firming up of the Access to Elected Office Fund and a duty on ministers to look at other protected characteristics that might be supported, and an online voter information platform. And really, I guess what I really wanted to pull out from this is the firstly that change is happening in Wales, and it's a really positive thing, but pull out kind of some lessons that I think might be useful. I don't think we have it all right in Wales, but there's definitely some things that I think have been really interesting that have emerged from these conversations. The first of these, kind of touching on incrementalism, is this idea of democratic reform being very much a process, not an event. And everyone who's from Wales and the audience will probably roll their eyes at this, but it really has been a process of democratic reform. And I think we have to see positive democratic change as something that can't be done overnight. It's really easy to put barriers up to democracy. That can be done overnight, and all of a sudden you've got an election where people have to show ID and it's really prohibitive. Removing those barriers takes longer. It takes time to embed, and almost I think reform in Wales will be a generational change. It's going to take a while to get there. The second thing I wanted to touch on is leadership. Willie, you touched on this earlier. I don't know if anyone will agree, but I think it's a pretty difficult time to make the case for more politicians. It's not an ideal thing for politicians to be up saying we need more politicians, but the reality is in Wales that we really do, and it's down to kind of leadership of people like the First Minister Mark Drakeford and the Council General Mick, who sat in the front here, of being able to kind of grasp that nettle and say, actually, we need to do this because it's the right thing to do. And then the final thing I wanted to kind of recognise really is the fact that I think democratic reform in Wales has largely been down to cross-party and consensual working. Change in Wales requires, well, major constitutional change in Wales requires a 2/5 majority, so it requires parties to work together. And I think it's a really good example that Welsh Labour and Plaid Cymru, I think Adam Price was here earlier, I'm not sure he's still here, have been able to kind of work together so positively to deliver a package of reform that's so positive for Wales. And finally, really quickly, just a shout out to the collaboration, I think, between government and the third sector and other partners in Wales, I think has been genuinely UK leading. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jess. Just to briefly come back to leadership, what do you think, what would you say is the difference between the way that Mark Drakeford leads and say somebody like Nicola Sturgeon?
That's a big question. They're very different people, I think.
Yeah.
But I do think that, I mean, Mark's obviously, the First Minister's obviously indicated that he is standing down shortly, but I think he has governed on a point of principle. I think he is not one of those politicians that necessarily does things because he thinks that they might be a vote winner. It's very much about doing the right thing for Wales. And I mean, that's not a criticism of Nicola Sturgeon or kind of Scottish politics necessarily. I think it's just a very distinct way that he has governed in Wales.
Yeah, thanks. I always like his humility. I think that's a great thing that Mark has in leadership. Yeah, do you want to say anything about leadership in Northern Ireland or political leadership?
I don't know what to say about leader. Do you know what? Like each party like does have really good leadership. I think the leadership of Champion's really great. Alliance have really amazing leadership. I mean, as much as I am mad at the DUP for not coming back to the table, it is not true that that opinion doesn't reflect their voter base, because it does. A lot of unionist voters don't want them to come back in a sense, because they agree that they think the Windsor Framework is a threat to their identity. So yeah, I think leadership does, I have to say, actually, yeah, the leadership really, it does generally reflect like the voter base quite well. Yeah. Sometimes too well, and then we get into these stalemates.
That's maybe one of the things about a proportional system. Just before I come to the audience, I was going to ask you about the contrast in incrementalism, that there seems to be evolution in Wales, right? But the British, I mean, there's been democratic backsliding. So why can Wales make progress, but Britain seems almost preserved in aspect in some ways?
Because in England, we've been led by lying, corrupt, incompetent politicians. And in Wales, they haven't. It is a leadership issue. And I think if there's a different government of whatever political, however it works out, well, it'll be Labour, hopefully we'll have a better form of government. Ethics matter, principles matter. Saying what your principles are and trying to stick to them, and trying not to lie or steal money from people or give corrupt contracts to your friends and in big business, and allow people to die because of your because the policies you pursue, whether it's children in poverty or older people in care homes. That's England. That's what's happened. That's leadership. Sorry about that. Not my fault. I didn't vote for them.
Thanks. You did touch on some. I don't know if the guys here who spoke about Aristotle yesterday and the virtues. I mean, good comment. And where are the virtues in our political life? Okay, I'm just going to open up to questions. We'll take it in groups of 3. Comments are welcome as well. So I know this guy at the back's been had his hand up for a while. And any women? There's one there. And there's a woman there. I'm going to take 2 women for every man, I think. Because
Thank you. That was a really interesting panel. I just wanted to, before I ask my question, do a quick shout out to Jess Blair and Katie Welsh in the room, who are two fantastic female leaders who I think are driving the implementation of a lot of really exciting things that are happening in Wales. So just a quick shout out. Yeah. My question was, so I'm very aware, as you know, as somebody who says that they run an organisation who works across the UK but is based in London specifically, that there is often what we mean when we talk about, you know, UK wide, we actually mean England. And I guess it was just a question for the panel of what more can organisations in this room be doing to support the work that you're doing, often really exciting work that's happening across the UK, and really live up to that idea of working across all 4 nations.
Thanks. Good. Women in the green tank top.
Thank you. I guess my question is about one of the key differences between the Westminster Parliament and the other parliaments is that by their nature of being newer, they exist in more modern buildings. And with the process of restoration and renewal of the Palace of Westminster hopefully happening at some point soon, what lessons could Westminster learn through that process from the more modern buildings, and then in parallel with that, them being potentially more modern workplaces and their kind of procedures that come from that?
Okay, thanks. Frances, do you want to talk about the building?
Well, it's very pretty, but it's every time I go, I think it's dripping everywhere, and just walking through the sewerage, it's delightful. Yeah, it needs to change. Obviously, it needs to change. We don't need to have a chamber where they're held 2 sword lengths away from each other. So obviously, the building needs to be replaced, and I think there are lessons from the devolved nations and their parliaments, obviously. But there are still questions. We haven't, the Commission hasn't dealt with devolved democracy. We're going to concentrate on local democracy, which will, I hope, it will engage with local democracy in Scotland. And I think there's a very interesting comment about how in Scotland they've replicated the sucking of power into the centre, a beautiful parliamentary building, but you know, that's where all the power rests. One of the examples, and I think something that I was against that happened in Scotland, was the centralisation of policing. So all local police, and there are lots of problems with doing things locally. People are very eccentric and difficult, and some of the police forces in Scotland were quite eccentric, but you know, they were locally accountable. Having policing Scotland and having one police force, and I think it'll be interesting to see how that's done when criminal justice is devolved in Wales as well. Don't do that. Don't do that. Keep it local. So there are lessons to be learnt from buildings and from how things have gone in the devolved nations. Of course, the big debate about the House of Lords at the moment, the devolved nations only have 1 house each. And that if you're going to develop a more sophisticated parliament, the question for devolved nations is, do you need 2 houses, as well as having more local representatives in the Senate? It's a question. I don't know. Somebody can answer it.
Thanks. Yeah, it's true in Scotland, power has been centralised in Edinburgh, but it's this old precept that say organisation, say oligarchy. I think that's what we've got to be aware of in democracy. Any organisation that you build is going to tend towards the oligarchical. Sturgeon was an example of that. So how are you honest about that, and then building the checks and balances to stop that happening? Just on the quit, I mean, Scotland and Wales sometimes feel left out of the consciousness of British politics, but Northern Ireland even more so, I think. So on the question about how do we get more awareness and engagement in what's going on there?
Yeah, so no surprise that we often feel like a second thought, or that we're always forgotten about. Not to sound a bit like radical, but you know, Northern Ireland is in the Union because the UK colonized Ireland, and whether you're a unionist or not, that is a fact. So it's the least you could do is remember that we're here. You know, yeah. So yeah, remember that we're here. I guess I when you're in London, I used to live here. It's so easy to just be in the Westminster bubble and forget about everybody. Like, I get that it's really easy, but one thing I really like that the Democracy Network does is that, you know, they've made a real effort to reach out to Northern Ireland. So I guess just be cognizant. Yeah, and could I say about the modern buildings? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so we have a lovely new storefront. It's a really nice modern building. For me, it's really important because working on, getting more women into politics, and that means more disabled women, make sure the buildings are accessible. A lot of the councils in Northern Ireland weren't, and most of them are now. And then also, again, women in politics, mothers, making sure that there's the facilities there to be able to virtually check into meetings. Like most councils in Northern Ireland kept that on from COVID. So you don't actually have to be at a council chamber to be a part of the meeting anymore, which is great. So yeah, those modern things, they just make it more possible for more diverse people to be in politics. And obviously that's better for democracy overall.
Sorry. Yeah, so just on the Hattie's question on what organisations can do in England to engage in the regions in Wales, I might do a little plug if that's all right. So we at ERS Cymru convene a group called Democracy Group Cymru. It's a little bit like the Democracy Network, but it's actually largely with organisations who aren't democracy organisations who don't largely work in democracy. The idea behind it was to set up basically a network with anyone that worked with groups that were less likely to be registered when the franchise changes came in. And that's kind of snowballed, I think, into a group that's now relatively active around all of the democratic changes. Some organisations dip in and out. It's quite informal and it's quite an open space. So if any organisations did want to kind of even listen in or join the Democracy Group Cymru, please feel free to get in touch. On the buildings, I do think that the Senedd was purposely designed as a building, I think, to kind of reflect that new modern, more consensual politics. And obviously the chamber is round, which I think is very different to the Westminster adversarial, I can't talk today, adversarial kind of two benches opposing each other. And I think that does make a difference in terms of debate. But I would say that there's a long way to go in terms of making it the completely family-friendly institution that it was set out to be. The lack of a creche, I think, is a major issue. There was the We Belong Here event to try and increase women standing for election, essentially. And that was the first time the Senedd had a creche, and it was just amazing to see kids running around a national parliament and kind of really kind of being like, oh my God, we're in a place where politicians make decisions, and look, there's some cool games over there we can play. There's a lot more ambition that we could have in truly making the Senedd a really family-friendly place. And I haven't really talked about representation, but there's a huge amount of work going on in Wales to increase women's representation in particular. And then I think there's still massive questions over how we kind of broaden diversity in a wider sense, in particular race and ethnicity. Yeah, so I'm not sure if the Council General might touch on this. I'm not sure at all, but there were plans for another piece of legislation, because 2 bills aren't enough, 3 bills. This one around gender quotas to go alongside that package of reform for the Senedd. That was meant to be introduced in December. It hasn't been introduced yet. We're still hopeful that there will be mechanisms to ensure that more women stand and are elected at the next elections.
And just to answer your question a bit, or at least touch on it, and to bring in the comment about Northern Ireland, one of the big weaknesses of the British state is that it's a legacy of empire. It was a system that was built to run an empire. Parts of the UK are still the victims of that, and parts of the world still are. So I think just recognising that it's the set institutions and that it was built for something that, does it I think the way that you are, yeah, I think the way that you articulated explained a lot, so thanks for that. Well, I don't have answers to something as difficult as that. Yeah. Good, thanks for that. I'm going to go back to some questions. There's somebody from online. Is there anybody online wants to ask a question? Yeah, okay. So there's the guy at the back in the grey jumper, the woman in front of him in the white shirt, and the woman in the blue jumper there.
Thanks. To what extent does the proposed reform to the electoral system for the Senedd complicate the campaign for proportional representation outside of Wales, both at local and national level, given maybe some of the reservations in this room about the system?
Just woman in the white, yeah, in front of you.
Thank you. I just wondered if you had any insights on the fact that in Wales and Scotland, it feels like the people, whether it's politicians or the general public, are much more ready to have deliberative democracy. Feel like citizen assemblies happening there are much more impactful. You know, obviously they haven't been perfect, but there seems to be much more of an appetite there. And I wonder if that is to do with the government's being devolved away from Westminster, and that actually the blockage is in Westminster more than in the devolved regions for that.
Thanks. Good question.
Hi, I'd just be interested in Northern Ireland. Is there any civic engagement or pressure or cross-party activities or actions that can help stop the blockage and not, you know, totally rely on Westminster, basically external, making progress?
Thank you.
Liz Crosby, Alliance Now. My question is to all the speakers as to how we can make this a more equal, or dare I say even democratic union. We have a highly centralized state and we have inequality between the nations. And however we devolve, we have to address that inequality between the nations.
Thanks, Liz. Jess, do you want to take the question about Welsh electoral system?
Yeah, I think in short, it's complicated, isn't it? So for a little bit of background, the Senedd, the electoral system currently in the bill for the Senedd elections for 2026 is a closed list PR list system. That wasn't short at all, was it? That was overcomplicating it. But also in the bill, which I think is a really good thing, is a review mechanism for after the next election, which will basically assess the effectiveness of the recent reforms against a number of criteria, including the health of a democracy. I think proportionality is in there, citizens' voice. So I think that does kind of lend a positive lesson for Westminster. It's again a process, and I do think there is an element of clear red water. You know, what happens in Wales isn't necessarily something a UK Labour would want to reflect, but I would hope that there is enough positivity in what is happening in Wales that UK Labour can look to many of the innovations we've got going on there, particularly things like automatic voter registration, the Constitutional Commission that is currently ongoing in Wales at the moment, I think is a really key piece of work. There's many lessons I think a UK Labour government can learn from Wales, and I really hope that an electoral system, which wouldn't be our preference either, but we do feel that there's optimism in the future, doesn't necessarily deter that.
Civic society.
Yeah. So there's a very good civil society organizations in Northern Ireland that are working cross-party at the minute to obviously put pressure on parties to come back. And one of the big things is, you know, because of this cost of living crisis that's particularly bad in Northern Ireland. But there's only so much they can do if the DUP has a very, you know, concise and clear red line that is the Windsor framework, which is confusing because that's not a devolved issue. But yeah, they do. I mean, there's a really good civil society, but as I said, the budget that was given to Northern Ireland by the Secretary of State was ridiculously small, and so like even the good work that they would have done in the past in similar pauses, it's been really reduced because there's just no money at the minute. It's very dire for civil society in Northern Ireland at the minute.
Keir Starmer made a speech at the Labour Party conference basically about Scotland for all sorts of electoral reasons. He didn't mention Wales. They not only forget about Northern Ireland, they also forget about Wales. And yet it's a Labour authority, there's a Labour government, and they've done some really fantastic things. They've got a Minister for the Future, or somebody, Commissioner for the Future, which is fantastic. There's lots of exciting things going on in Wales that we could learn from. I just want to say something about citizens' assemblies. we've done a paper, the Commission's done a paper on citizens' engagement with democracy as sort of an individual, local and civic society engagement. And we did look at citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries. And there's a really interesting example going on in Jersey at the moment, where they've had a citizens' assembly which has decided what it wants to do on assisted dying, which is a very difficult, complicated, sensitive moral issue. And they've decided they want to introduce it. Now the government's going back on it slightly, but it is a way, it's a really good example, a way of introducing complicated things and using people's innate moral virtue. Is that right? Aristotelian moral virtue? I don't know who said it. Yes, I wasn't here, but yeah. It's out there. People have it. Politicians may not, but people do.
Thanks. Yeah, just to end on the question about the devolved institutions and their more flexibility and openness to democratic innovations like citizens' assemblies. I think that's true. And we see what's happening in Wales and in Scotland. The government did embrace big style citizens' assemblies. They spent a lot of money on running them very, very well. It did come up against a buffer when you had one set of deliberations and recommendations which had solid democratic legitimacy. Citizens' assemblies done well, have solid democratic legitimacy, but then it hit up against the Parliament and the ministers' democratic legitimacy, and they didn't really know what to do about it. And so I think we're trying to work that through in Scotland, it's about institutionalising these structures. And I think they're really important. I think to respond to one of the panels this morning, because they kind of stimulated me, and I didn't get a chance to say this, but it's really important to build alternative sites of power in communities and other places. And I think what we've seen in Edinburgh is that centralisation of power in Edinburgh, because there's nobody asking for it anywhere else. And I think if you're addressing that question of the iron law of oligarchy that inevitably centralises, then you have to make sure that you're building sites of power in other parts of the system. And I think citizen assemblies are a great way to do that. If they're institutionalised and in local communities, then they can, they will be able to put pressure on the centre for stuff because they've got democratic legitimacy, more so than councils in some ways. When I was a councillor, I was elected on something like 4 or 5% of the people that could vote. So yeah, I think that's really important. And the difference between that and Westminster, do you know, things are changing more quickly than ever. Technology is what drives most social economic change. You can see that with the windmill. You can see it with the steam engine. The technology that we're facing now and the incremental change in that is so much faster than it's ever been before. So we have systems of government that are not responsive to that and can't change to it. No wonder they're failing. And Westminster is kind of stuck like that. It's got that giant toad of tradition and the empire sitting on it and stopping it move. So thanks for all the questions. On Lizzie's question, it's not only Scotland and Wales, it's like parts of and Northern Ireland, there's parts of England as well. It's lots of regional inequality is probably the biggest problem this country's got to face. And when you do it comparative to most other states, it's terrible. Scotland's kind of balked that a bit, and I think that's an argument for giving power to other places. It doesn't have to be regions. I'm for power in towns and cities, actually, communities. But okay, that's my. Just want to thank the panel and thanks for your contributions. And we'll just end the panel session there.